One, two, three, four.
You are listening to SKYLIT, the SKYLIT Books podcast. SKYLIT Books is a general interest bookstore in the Los Feliz neighborhood in Los Angeles. You can shop with us from 10 a.m. to 10 p.m. or visit us online 24/7 at skylitbooks.com. Follow along at SKYLIT Books Instagram and Twitter. You can subscribe to the podcast on Podbean, iTunes, and Spotify. Thank you for listening, and now on to the episode.
Hello, lovely listeners, and welcome to SKYLIT. This is the SKYLIT Books podcast, and I'm your host, Natalie Freeman. Today, we're so thrilled to welcome Benjamin Hedin to read from his debut novel, Under the Spell, and after that, he'll be joined in conversation by Maaza Mengiste. Before I introduce them, I wanted to remind you that SKYLIT Books is open for in-store browsing, and you can always shop online 24/7 at skylitbooks.com. Benjamin Hedin is the author of In Search of the Movement, The Struggle for Civil Rights, Then and Now, and editor of the anthology Studio A, The Bob Dylan Reader. He has written for The New Yorker, Time, The Atlantic, The Oxford American, and The Chicago Tribune, among other publications. Also a Grammy-nominated producer of documentary films, he wrote the films Two Trains Runnin', about the search for two forgotten blues singers, and the multiple award-winning 2021 documentary MLK FBI, called Eye-Opening and Jaw-Dropping by Rolling Stone. He lives in Atlanta. Maaza Mengiste is the author of The Shadow King, shortlisted for the 2020 Booker Prize and a recipient of the American Academy of Arts and Letters Award in Literature, as well as LA Times Books Prize finalist. It was named a Best Book of 2019 by New York Times, NPR, Time, Elle, and other publications. Beneath the Lion's Gaze, her debut, was selected by The Guardian as one of the 10 best contemporary African books. We are so excited to have you both. Thank you for being here.
Thank you, Nat.
Thank you, Nat. Ben, did you want to start off by reading us a little bit of Under the Spell?
Sure. And again, I'm so grateful to you and to Skylights for hosting this reading, and especially to be in conversation with Maaza. It's a real honor and a privilege for me. Maaza and I taught together what feels like long ago at NYU, 2009, 2010.
Yeah, a long time ago.
Taught writing and then I saw a review of The Shadow King and I was like, oh, okay, I think I know her, and I ordered the book and I started reading this extraordinary novel with this epic canvas and just such beautifully and poetically concise prose and these structural felicities. I mean, it was like reading The English Patient. And so then, we sort of reconnected in the past year. Really thankful to be here with you, Maaza.
No, it's really my pleasure, Ben. I can't wait to talk to you a little bit more about our experiences in the writing program that we taught, and the ways that it might have influenced your writing and maybe mine, I think. So I'm excited for this. Thank you.
Under the Spell is about a woman named Sandra whose husband dies suddenly in a car accident on New Year's Eve. She's not all that old. They were in their mid-30s. They didn't have any kind of a will or inheritance set up. And so she has to sort through his financial records and his email to get the probate in order. When she does that, she finds a thread from another woman. And she doesn't know what it is. The emails are suggestive, but not directly incriminating one way or the other. She can't make out if her husband was having an affair or if he wasn't. And when the woman writes back, or writes an email, I should say, she wagers that perhaps she hasn't heard of her husband's death, Dale's death. And so she hits reply, impersonating her dead husband. And then a correspondence begins. And that's the premise of the novel. And I'm going to just read a short excerpt that's from the first days after his accident. um, when she's grieving and coming to terms with the fact that her marriage was not what she thought it was. She's also alone in the house. She decides to sell her house. She's not eating. She's suffering panic attacks. Fairly common things during bereavement. She typed grief vertigo in a search engine and fell into a sinkhole of pages about mourning, reading heat scans of the brain and ads for anti-anxiety drugs, charts showing suicide rates for the bereaved, customs written during the Victorian age, do's and don'ts. No chilled foods, for instance, not for those suffering from irreparable loss. Last month on NPR, there was an interview with a doctor named Comstock, who had written a book called Under the Spell, Journeys into Grief. In it, he profiled survivors of every imaginable catastrophe, widows of mob hits, those who had fled a tsunami, parents who lost their child in a school shooting. And in the aftermath, he said anything was possible. It was beyond the power of medicine or pharmacology to predict. People might forget their names or sued for divorce, become hunger artists, fasting for a year, or wander the hallway of their high school and break down in front of their old locker. Rob banks, perform unaccountable acts of charity. One man whose wife died in a helicopter accident adopted the son of the pilot. Clairvoyance had been reported, moments of glimpsing the unseen, like getting to the top of a mountain, Comstock said, and looking out over the clouds. Why no, Sandra thought. Put it like that, and it almost sounds romantic, the state you would want to be in. It's not that way at all. And then skipping ahead a little bit to after she has discovered these other emails, read some of them, and is trying to grapple with their implications. She learns, or she remembers, that she had saved a few voicemails from her husband. Sandra pressed 7 to delete the message and walked into the kitchen and stood with her hands on the countertop. She was looking at her phone, the screenshot a photo of Dale's taken in the Pyrenees, the mountainside banked in mist. Her uncle, who lived in Po, had bought a house there, one that was said to have been used by the Gestapo during the war for interrogation. When the screen faded, she put her hand to it to keep it from going black and turned and opened the refrigerator. Inside the door was a bottle of Prosecco Dale had bought for New Year's, only they learned one of Cheryl's friends was planning to make a similar drink, so they had left it at home. She twisted in the corkscrew and poured a glass and dialed her voicemail again. She had not listened to the messages yet. She thought if she had to, she could hold out for another week. Yet she also felt now was the time to do it. Do it and stop thinking about it. There were 3 of them saved. In the first, Dale read the model number on a set of tires and asked if she could find a lower price. In the second, nothing save the click of the connection ending. We trekked away from the bar and through the snow to be able to say happy birthday from the top of the world. Then, and she could tell he was talking to Reed, holding the phone away. And she did too. He always hid presents in the storage closet in the garage. She pressed 9 to save the message and drank the Prosecco and was about to call Reed and share it with him, but stopped. There was something else. What? It passed before her, indecipherable, and passed again. He had emailed Ryan Whitehurst about it. Sandra was almost positive. She went back to his account to check. This is an email that he had sent to the other woman. Shooting in Whistler, not the resort, but one of the mountains behind it, following this band of snowboarders who I guess are also a cult. They're Bolivian. No doubt he was texting her in the bar. Impossible that he wouldn't, being with Reed, drinking, unless he was observing some silent code of conduct, saying, no, I will not do it on Sandra's birthday. Either way, she would have to delete the message. Hearing it, she wouldn't be able to think of anything except Ryan Whitehurst. She played it again, and this time when it was finished, she hit 7. It was all going to be like this, she saw. Nothing was safe now, nothing inviolate. She was in a state of free fall. She backed up, hoping to find a memory that was free of the contaminant of Ryan Whitehurst, and settled on their first trip down the Pacific Coast Highway. The days when Dale had seemed like her double. By the time he died, each knew they were not, but there was no regret in the way things had turned out. Each believed they had given up certain similarities in order to enjoy something larger, a marriage built on a hidden and more fundamental compatibility. Yet who, after all, was Ryan Whitehurst but another version of the person Sandra had been in her 20s? A cinephile, unencumbered. The profile was unmistakable, even down to the same bag they each had, the clutch. Dale was still searching for his double. Perhaps this was the lesson of grief, the thing he saw after scaling the mountain and getting over the clouds, that people were the sum of their secrets. And when they died, there was no picking the lock, for they took it with them. The tintype, an ankle bracelet, the password and answers to the security questions, the sale of stock, and now the email, the horror deriving not from jealousy, but the threat of nullification. To find out the most intimate thing in your life, your marriage, was also the most alien. That all you thought was not.
Thank you so much for that, Ben. That was really a wonderful reading. Listening to this and knowing some of the work that you also do outside of writing, I was struck by this line, people are the sum of their secrets, which seems like a pivotal moment in this story. And I wondered if you could talk a little bit more about this. I'm going to do a bit of the EWP on you, and we can break that down for listeners in a minute. But I find that that line or that thought echoing maybe in the latest documentary of yours that I saw, the MLK FBI, people being the sum of their secrets. But I'm curious about this story that seems to be, it's about loss, it's about memory, it's about what we really know about human beings and about ourselves in relation to them. How did this book come to you? And I wonder if the questions that you're asking in this book are questions that you've been asking in other things that you do as well, other films or maybe other projects.
Sure. No, that's a very acute connection, Maaza. I mean, because you're right. MLK FBI. That's a documentary. I mean, that seems a long way, or pretty far removed from a book, about a married couple set in Oregon in the present day. But in a way, it's about secrets, or it's about the uncovering of secrets, and that with the FBI following King so assiduously, he effectively gave up any notion of a private life. And in this book, which I wanted to write originally just as a short story, something like 5,000 to 6,000 words, as 10 years ago, more than 10 years ago, and it kept mushrooming, and I began to see larger formal possibilities for it that made me want to write it as a novella. And you're right. I mean, one of the book's keynotes is that people are the sum of their secrets, which is also just a thread in the best fictions, certainly in Henry James or in Dickens. And in some ways, it's the fictional process itself. It's, it's the bearing of privacy. It's imaginary people, but it's still making the private act public, which is what happens to her late husband.
And in writing this book that you imagined it as a short story, and how how did it begin to develop? At what point did you realize that you were in the process of writing something longer? And I guess maybe my question is, maybe you could speak about a particular moment in here when you said, oh, this is about to take me in a direction that I did not expect. I was captivated by, the thinking work that went into the idea of a woman who discovers, or in the fact that her husband dies in an accident and then impersonates him in a correspondence with someone else. At what point did this story begin to branch into all these other things? I'm really interested and curious about that.
It was probably, I can't recall the exact moment, but I think it was almost certainly when I began to write the emails. And the novel sort of settles into this epistolary back and forth for 8 pages or so. And I realized that when she's impersonating her dead husband, that opens up a lot of fertile, ironic terrain. And that, she continues to be her dead husband, and the correspondence that she carries on with this other woman, it ends up becoming much more intimate and candid than the correspondence that her husband had with her. And so that's one irony that I wanted to plumb, that in a way she ends up deepening this relationship that was actually sort of, casual. And that secondly, I don't want to say that she becomes the villain of the story, but she's effectively catfishing somebody. And that complicates the reader's sympathy, because up until that point, of course, it's very easy to feel sorry for her. She's a victim of terrible circumstances. But then, 100 pages later, she's something else. She's someone who, in that excerpt I read, it has fallen under the spell of grief. And is being taken in a direction that she never thought herself capable of, and really hurting somebody in the process.
I wondered, were there any discoveries you made along the way about grief, maybe, or about friendship as you were creating these two women, or pseudo dead person and a woman in conversation with each other?
Well, I'm not sure. I mean, nothing like this has ever happened to me. So this is, fiction. I mean, for the most part, it is a surmise, this state of Sandra's that's rendered. But I think that, if there were any discoveries that were made, particularly in the way that she begins to take care of this 4-year-old, that sort of just falls into her life, and she effectively becomes her guardian for a handful of weeks, is that, grief does give you, this second self, or these other opportunities for transformation. I don't want to say it's a blessing or that you're glad it occurred, but that one is an offshoot, of loss.
I'm going to say something that's very cliche right now, which is that writing is a very solitary act, and you do it alone, and yet you have this background with filmmaking, and those are collaborative efforts. What was the process like to do one and the other? Were you doing both at the same time? Some filmmaking in addition to writing this book, or did you have to set one aside? What was that like?
No, I mean, I will say I was lucky in the filmmaking schedule that when it came time to just totally focus on Under the Spell and get it done and not do anything else, I was between films. So, the calendar worked out that way. And as, you mentioned EWP, that we both taught in the expository writing program. Film, I started making films around the time I left EWP, and I've always considered it to be probably in some form a substitute for teaching, in that it's the opposite of the writer's life in so many ways. It's social, it's collaborative, it thrives on deadlines, not that dissimilar from the academic calendar. And you know, I'm sure you've had this experience in your own writing. You can revise forever. I mean, you can just like, a book's sort of done. It's not arbitrary, but you know, you could always, like, I could rewrite Under the Spell 3 different ways right now.
Yeah.
And you know, with filmmaking, like, time and money will run out, and you have to deliver it. It is the opposite. You know, obviously there are creative similarities between the processes, but filmmaking, I think it appeals to me because even just being in my study alone 4 hours a day, I'm pretty crazy by the end of those 4 hours. Yeah. But I wanted to ask you, it is solitary, but it is important for me to have somebody in mind. Like, I know at least one person will read this. And otherwise it's hard for me to move forward. Are you like that?
That's interesting. I know that when I was writing this book, I was really, if I had to think about who I was imagining at the other end, I have to say that I was really imagining myself at the other end of this process, not knowing anything that I had written. Maybe I was imagining a reader just like me. Maybe that wasn't me, but it's just like me. I wasn't thinking of any particular person, but I felt that I had taken so many risks with this book that I wasn't sure what would happen. I was just trying to imagine, will I like it? Will I like it at the end of whatever this is? I don't know what's going to happen, but is this chapter something that would lead me to read the next thing, the next chapter? So that's the way that I was thinking of it. I didn't have a reader, but I do think, now that we're back on EWP, which is the Expository Writing Program, for listeners who are wondering what that code word is for. And it's a program that Ben and I taught at NYU. It was first year writing for incoming freshmen. They either loved it or hated it, or really hated it. But it was. And it was, I've always imagined it's a way to teach students creative nonfiction. And I think I have imagined a reader who was doing the kind of thinking that we did together in groups when we would have these big meetings, or maybe a group of us sitting around after conferences at a bar, talking about ideas. I imagine that reader.
Yes. So not a passive reader,
right?
But someone really engaged and
yeah, I think so. Yeah, but it's always interesting to me to see somebody who has also come out of this program, because we were. I feel like we went into it not quite knowing what we would be teaching, and then we were taught to think the way that we were trying to teach our students to think, and we were shown, the ways of putting texts and ideas together that felt sometimes incompatible, but then it worked. And I wondered if some of this thinking that we were doing in this program, or that we did as instructors, also fed into your own creative process.
Yes, no, I think, I want to say inevitably it did, but I certainly fortunately it did, because, that then with teaching, for it to eventually inform and influence your own work, I mean, that's what you sort of hope will happen. And yeah, I mean, it certainly shaped my view of ideal creative nonfiction, the way that it should incorporate myriad sources and, be a kind of salad. That comes from EWP. And, my last book, In Search of the Movement, The Struggle for Civil Rights Then and Now, that also came out of a lot of discussions that I would have with my students, and, viewing the present and the past as commingling as one. And so, yeah, I mean, has it been that way for you? You're still teaching, but not there.
I'm still teaching, yeah, different. I teach creative writing, but I find myself still using some of the techniques that not techniques, but some of the idea work that we were doing in the classroom, or some of the texts, some of the ways that I speak of texts now, I think for sure had to be influenced by what we were doing in that program.
I mean, if I wanted to read an EWP influence on Shadow King, I mean, I could. When I think of the structural devices and the way that you move back and forth, I mean, would that be accurate? Or I mean,
maybe, yeah.
Hard to say.
Yeah, partly it's hard to know what came first, the chicken or the egg with this, but I definitely think it developed. This was a way of seeing, seemingly disparate things. It definitely taught me how to work with images, which is something I'm curious about in your own work. How to integrate them into written work, but how to literally work with images, how to look and conceive of them as ideas that are in a visual narrative. And I wondered if I'd love to hear you talk about this, the work that you've done, the filmmaking work you've done. The latest documentary is the MLK FBI, I think, unless there's another one I'm not aware of, but I know you're working on other projects. How did this work with film, how does it begin to inform the writing life that you have? And how did it begin to inform either the writing process or the work that you did in this book?
Well, again, like you, it's a little bit of a chicken and egg. It's hard to know which came first, but it certainly helped, I think, with pacing, and with, showing everything a little bit up front, and then, cutting away, and then so in how you think of organization, because in writing you're at liberty to do this. In film, you almost have to do this. We just start in the middle of things. And then kind of back up. You can't be purely linear. I mean, you can be, but it's, especially in documentary, it's hard to sustain a viewer's attention that way. And so you do have to kind of mash chronology and make it whirl around. And I would hope that my writing would reflect that work.
Yeah, and I'd like to get back now a little bit to the book and think about, I'm really interested in the inspirations that you had that led to this. Maybe not the particular plot itself, but what was it about a domestic story? It feels like a very intimate story, a story of a marriage, a story of loss. And I'm setting it next to the work that you've done that feels almost epic. Bob Dylan, MLK, writing about the blues, the civil rights movement, these epic moments in history. And now this book is this really fascinating look at one or two women's lives. How did that come about? What inspired you to maybe move into a smaller space?
Probably my reading, and the books that really inform this, the stories of Alice Munro in particular, who uses, she uses letters quite a lot. I'm using letters counterpart email. I like the idea that you could I think that's one of the reasons why the book is short. I will say that, I would love to write it as 100,000 words. I could not for the life of me figure out a way to do that. And then when I was finishing it, it kept on getting shorter and shorter. And I was like, where do I draw the line? I mean, maybe, so yeah.
I want to learn that trick,
Yeah.
Ben. I really want to do that because I'm determined to make whatever I write next short, and I'm not sure I know how. There is a talent to that.
Yeah, but there is a talent for writing long too, don't you? I mean, Shadow King would never work. Well, I mean, I won't say never, but it's like as soon as you pull Shadow King under 300 pages, I mean, you're going to lose a lot of what makes that such a memorable and captivating read, right? Was it always long? Was it always a big book for you?
I mean, it was as hard as I tried to keep cutting and cutting and cutting. And there are times now where I think I'm gonna start a short story, and I can already tell by that first sentence I'm creeping into something that's going to be much longer, and I just said, forget it. You know, I don't have the energy right now to start this. So I'm fascinated by books that are short. There are you know, a lot of writers I have been looking up, trying to see how they did it, because there is a pacing to it, but there's also a consideration about what can be eliminated, and still the scenes that are next to each other create a through line. You know, and I wonder if this is in part from your experience as a filmmaker, maybe a producer who's just always cutting, you know, much to the chagrin of a director, maybe, or is this something you think that your filmmaking has helped with, just learning how to cut, how to edit?
No, yeah, no doubt, it helps. I mean, like when you make a film, you can't hang on to anything, right? Any sort of bashfulness about cutting, you immediately have to just put away, and that probably does come over into writing. That just you know, you cut it and you get on with your life. Yeah.
I'm wondering if is there a scene in your book that that was maybe the most difficult to write, maybe because of the delicacy of it, maybe there was another reason, but is there a moment in this book that really sticks out to you as something that you had to edit or work through? And I'd love to hear more about that, if so.
You know, I'll say, Maaza, that at the end of the book, the very last couple of pages, you know, Sandra does sell her house in Oregon, in part for cash considerations and in part because she's in this tailspin and needs to forge a new life. And she doesn't have really a coherent plan, and so she drives home to be with her parents. And I was always going to have her, that was where the book was supposed to end, like being at home, you know, in this sort of springtime morning. I mean, it was, you know, there was always going to be a quasi-affirmative ending. And that when this happened to me once on I-95, that it snowed and they closed the interstate and I was stuck. And, you know, so I sort of wrote about that. She's crossing Montana, there's a blizzard and I-90 is closed for a couple of hours. And I realized I could end the book there, you know, which is a cutting move. That she doesn't have to go all the way home. You don't have to do that. It can end right there in the snowstorm. And so sometimes cutting, it's not even in the revising or in the highlighting of the sentence and pressing the delete key, but it's in the very, you know, interplay of the scenes or in the duration of the scenes. When you drop the curtain is such an important question.
Absolutely. It's interesting to think about how your filmmaking eye came into that moment, but the writer just kept moving forward,
right,
so to speak. That's really interesting. I'm curious about you've done work in your other life with research, the civil rights movement, looking through, I think, historical documents and so on. And this was something that feels like it was more familiar, more contemporary. But did any aspect of research, that research hat that you would wear in your work in film, come into this book as well?
Not really, no. I mean, I really wanted to write this, you know, from inside, just, you know, from what I lived and what I read and shape that. Certainly I had to research things, but it was always after the fact. It was to check certain, you know, like in what I read, I mean, no chilled foods That comes from the year of magical thinking, right? So it's like, so I did borrow stuff, and I did read about bereavement, of course, but and it, you know, it trickled in, but mostly I was looking up things just to check myself. You know,
was there any questions that might have come up from writing two characters who were female, or was this just it was again a kind of writing from the inside on this? Like,
no, I mean, I didn't. Yeah, I tried to do my best on that. So, I mean, you know the Colson Whitehead line, right? Is that it made like, and you know, he says when he's writing women, he says people only ask about if I don't do a good job.
Mm-hmm.
And like, I think that fundamentally you're talking about persuasion, convincing somebody this is a credible look, you know, at a woman. I mean, I don't think women and men are all that different. So this is a different, that's a whole other thing. But like, it's ultimately a question about talent, and can you pull it off, and are the words there, and are they in the right order, and you know. So I viewed it that way. Not that I was transcribing a consciousness that I was in touch with, but that it was, you know, a kind of aesthetic question that I really wanted to pull off. It never was the main character, never, even if you go back to 2010, 2011, when the idea first struck, it was never a man. I don't know why, but it was always just, the pronoun comes into your head, she, and there it is.
Exactly. That I understand. I'm wondering about books that have influenced you. Maybe you mentioned, oh my gosh, the Didion book that A Year of Magical Thinking, and you've mentioned Alice Munro. Were there other writers that were influencing you as you wrote this, or as you were thinking about this?
Certainly those were the big ones. You know, I think that you know, the other, just two, like Don DeLillo's The Body Artist. It's a spare novel. It's shorter even than Under the Spell, and it's this woman whose boyfriend kills himself, and she's left alone in the house. And so, you know, a kind of similar premise. I think that was foundational. You know, again, I read that book almost 20 years ago, but I do think it was foundational to the story.
And I am curious about the advice that you might give to young writers who are listening right now. Maybe there are filmmakers out there too who are listening to this. What advice would you give them about starting out?
Make sure you finish. Right, it's easy to start, it's harder to sustain, but you know, so just remember that, like, the real difficulty comes in saying, I'm going to push through to the end. I don't know. What do you think about that for advice? That's maybe.
No, I think that's absolutely true. It's, I think people have the idea that you write just when you're inspired, and you have to write when you don't feel like it, or you have to sit down and do the work, whatever that is, to get to that finish point.
No, the poet Randall Jarrell, is the line attributed to him is that writing is just waiting around for the rain to fall. Yeah, so like you have to be at your desk for that to happen. So, you know, to your point. And so
absolutely. And one more thing.
I gotta ask, what are you working on?
Oh, I was gonna ask you the same thing.
You dropped
yeah, I'm slowly wading into the next book. Very, very, very slowly. I'm just doing a lot of reading right now, and trying to see what sticks, what inspires.
Yeah.
And hopefully it'll be short.
We'll come back in 5 years and we're gonna Do you write while you read then? Or?
Yeah, I do. I tend to, but I do a lot of so much of my reading is nonfiction, or especially now when I'm thinking about something, it tends to be, you know, historical documents.
Yeah.
Things that, so I read a lot of that, but it's fascinating to me. And then I'll see what comes from that, what sparks. Yeah. So, and what about you, Ben?
Yeah, I am working on a new novel, very different from Under the Spell. It's historical, and it's about this person who's a legend in folklore. So it's like this, it's a story that you go both ways. History says one story, folklore says another, and so
Always, yeah.
yeah,
Well, that's the best. That's the best kind of
Yeah.
story to write. I'm keeping my fingers crossed for that. That sounds fascinating.
yeah. Same to you, Maaza. Thank you.
Thank you.
Well, thank you both so much for being here. That was such a lovely conversation. We were so happy to facilitate it here at SKYLIT. Thank you again to Benjamin for sharing Under the Spell with us, and thank you to Maaza for your generous conversation. You can order your very own copy of Under the Spell at www.skylitbooks.com. Thank you for listening, and we hope to see you soon.
Thank you for listening to the SKYLIT Books podcast series. Please don't forget to visit our website at skylitbooks.com and make sure to follow us on Twitter and Instagram. Also, don't forget to subscribe to this podcast for more author talks and bookseller conversations. You can find us on Podbean, iTunes, and Spotify. Stay safe and healthy, and we hope to see you back in our store soon.